It has been called our national pastime. It's just as American as hot dogs and apple pie. Even those with no particular interest in sports or history are familiar with names like Babe Ruth, Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio. I'm referring, of course, to organized baseball. It's been around for a long time, going back to the middle of the 19th century. Its history is embedded in our national consciousness. Every year from early April until late October, every sports page and every newspaper from coast to coast are full of the box scores and standings of the major league teams. Few are the kids that never dreamt of becoming a big league player. Baseball's history is replete with well-known names like Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner, or famous moments like Babe Ruth's called home run shot in 1932 or Lou Gehrig's heartbreaking retirement speech in 1939. Its history is also riddled with scandal. The late 90s and early 2000s have been dubbed the steroid era of Major League Baseball. Roger Maris's single-season home run record of 61 stood for decades until it was crushed in quick succession within just 3 years. Sammy Sosa hit 66 home runs. Mark McGwire followed that with 70, and Barry Bonds an incredible 73 home runs in 2001. Yet all of that glory was shattered when they all either tested positive or admitted to using performance-enhancing drugs or steroids. Then there's the story of Pete Rose. To this day, Pete has more career hits than anyone else in Major League Baseball history, 4,256. He retired as an active player from the Cincinnati Reds in 1986. He was managing the team in 1989 when a special counsel report of John Dowd was released. That report detailed Pete Rose's history of gambling and betting on the game, even games that he was managing. And then finally, in the number one position of almost everyone's list of baseball scandals is the infamous Black Sox scandal of 1919. 8 co-conspirators of the Chicago White Sox agreed together to throw the World Series in 1919. That series was against the Cincinnati Reds that year. In return, each of them was supposed to receive $10,000. The fix was in. So what was one of the best teams in baseball history lost the series 5-3. Then rumors of the fix and suspicious underperformance by some of the best baseball players in history resulted in a grand jury being called in 1920. Indictments were handed down and a trial was set for 1921. Somehow between the decision to indict these players and the actual trial, all the written and consigned confessions of the accused players disappeared mysteriously. They were therefore inadmissible as evidence. The jury found all the players not guilty. All the players not guilty. But it didn't end there. Newly appointed commissioner of Major League Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis was his name, and he had this to say about the verdict, quote, "Regardless of the verdict of juries, no player that throws a ball game, no player that entertains proposals or promises to throw a game, no player that sits in a conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing games are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever again play professional baseball." He then banned all 8 players from professional baseball for life. Of course, for any of the Major League Baseball players, the ultimate goal, the most sought-after prize, in the end, is induction into the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. To be enshrined in baseball history is an honor that few receive, but all strive for. But for all the steroid users of the 90s, for Pete Rose, whose otherwise illustrious career would have ended up in Cooperstown for sure, and for the 8 men out in the Chicago Black Sox scandal of 1919, that display case in the Hall of Fame will never happen. None of them ever have or likely ever will, In spite of the many attempts that have been made at restoration, they'll never reach, even posthumously, the gold at the end of that rainbow. And so many of them, both now gone and those still living, they had and have lived with the knowledge that their own poor choices cost them dearly. It's called living with regret. And that is the subject of today's message in Isaiah chapter 5. You know, every time we have a decision to make, the choice that we make, sometimes we know that we shouldn't, and yet we do. And we end up paying a price we wouldn't have had to pay. Whenever that happens, regret is the result. Now, sometimes those choices have insignificant consequences and they don't last for very long. Like, oh, I should have had the lemon cake instead of the rhubarb pie. But other choices that we make are more significant and the consequences more serious. Like, I know that sign says do not enter, but it's the shortest distance between here and where I want to go. And so I make the turn, and the next thing I know, I see lights flashing in my rearview mirror. Because of disobedience toward God, the Jewish people of Isaiah's day would have a lot of experience in living with regret. In this 5th chapter of Isaiah, there's a list of 7 woes, and we started looking at those last week. The 7 woes are statements from God's prophet. You might recall that these statements begin with the word woe. They're not warnings. God isn't saying, I'm warning you, don't do this or this is going to happen. It's too late for warnings. You shouldn't do this has already been done. And so the word of prophecy that God has given to Isaiah to bring to the Jewish people is, because you did this, this is what's going to happen. That word woe, actually the Hebrew word hoi, it's not translatable. It's not a word that you really translate. It's an interjection, or we would call it an exclamation. And for those that weren't here last week, the illustration I use is there's parents going into an exclusive kind of pricey shop, and when you take the kids in, the first thing you say to them before you go through the door is, don't touch anything because everything in here is expensive and I don't want to have to buy it. And you're no sooner through the door then one of the kids is looking at this expensive trinket and you're about to say, no, don't do that, and you hear a crack. And what used to be one thing is now 2. And your response as a parent, understandable as it is simply, oh. That's the expression, oh. That is what woe means in Hebrew. That is the expression that Isaiah is using. 7 times he repeats that, oh. And what he means by that is God has revealed to him, because of what the Jews have done, they're going to pay a heavy price for it. These consequences are the judging hand of God. Of course, ultimately, the problem for these Jewish leaders, and that's this book, this scroll, was originally written to the Jews living in Judah and Jerusalem, particularly addressing the leadership of that people. And so God is telling those Jewish leaders, ultimately, their problem was their life's pursuit. They were not pursuing God. The thing that drove their life wasn't to get closer to God, to understand God better, to learn more about God. What drove their life was them. They became the center of their own lives. The decisions that they made were based on who the center of their life was. That always happened. It happens to us. The decisions that we make are going to be focused on what or who the center of our life is. If the center of my life is Jesus Christ, then every choice I make, every decision I make is going to be focused on Him. How does it glorify Christ? How does this obey Christ? How does this honor Christ? If He isn't the center of my focus, then I become the center of my focus. What do I feel like doing? What do I want to do? How do I want to spend my money? That's what these Jewish leaders were doing, and they were wrong in doing it, and now they're going to pay the price. Last week we looked at 2 of those things. They were after, their pursuit wasn't God. It was, number 1, it was wealth, and it was leisure and pleasure. That's what drove them. Ironic today so many of the people in our society, that's what they're driven by. Wealth, I need to acquire more. Leisure and pleasure, I want to do what makes me feel good or what I have fun doing. So they were driven by those two things. Those things took precedence over God in their hearts. Now where we pick up today here, we're in Isaiah chapter 5, and we're beginning at verse 18. We pick up that topic once again, and we see that there were two more woes that are pronounced by Isaiah. In this case, the Jewish leaders displayed two very wrong attitudes, beginning at verse 18. And in verses 18 and 19, the first attitude that they had that was wrong was a mindset that was upside down. A mindset that was upside down. Look at verse 18. Isaiah says, "Woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood, and sin as if with cart ropes." Now this is a metaphor. It's a picture in words. You know, in Scripture, you can almost always tell when you're reading a metaphor, because when you read it, the first thing you say is, "What? What is that supposed to mean?" If it doesn't sound like it makes sense, it's most likely a metaphor. That's what this is. Isaiah is drawing a picture in words. This was 2,700 years ago, so in order for us to understand what this picture is, we have to dissect it. We have to take it apart, so to speak. So look at that verse again. "What are those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood, and sin as if with cart ropes?" Two words that stand out right away. Number one is drag, and number two, the word cart. Drag and cart. Here's the picture. Picture, if you will, a cart on wheels. And it's been dragged, means it's being pulled through the city. It's being pulled with ropes that are attached to the cart and probably slung over the shoulder of whoever is pulling this thing. Now, since it's a metaphor, we have to understand what's the picture represent? What does the cart represent? What's the cart ropes represent? That's extremely important. The word is translated iniquity here. Woe to those who drag iniquity. The word translated iniquity is avon. In Hebrew, it means perversity, moral evil, or sin. So this cart that somebody is dragging through the streets represents the sin that is in the lives of these Jewish leaders. It's a cartload of sin. And they're dragging it through the streets. And what connects them to their sin, what enables them to be pulling this through the streets, are these cart ropes. What are the cart ropes? Actually, if you look in the next line, it tells you there, or I'm sorry, if you look in the preceding line, those who drag iniquity with cords of falsehood and sin as if with cart ropes. The cart ropes are cords of falsehood. It's the same exact thing. And the word that's translated falsehood is shav in Hebrew. It means lying. You see, what enabled them to have this wagon load of sin that they were dragging along with them as they lived was the lies that they were living with in their lives. That's what was pulling this cart of sin. The things that enabled them to be able to do this sin, to think, to say, and to do the things that dishonored God, was the fact that they were living a bunch of lies. You know what's interesting? This was written 2,700 years ago to the leaders in Judah. It could have been written 27 minutes ago to the leaders in our society, because the cart rope of sin that they're pulling along with them is being drawn by the lies that they believe, the lies that they tell themselves. You know, we all know that the mainstream media lies. You knew that, right? You can't hardly read anything from the mainstream media without taking it with a grain of salt and knowing that it's full of a pack of lies. But the political leaders in our country are constantly telling lies. And for most of them, the way that you can tell they're lying is their lips are moving. They wouldn't know the truth if it bit them. The other day, Friday, Chuck Schumer. Is that name familiar? Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, Democratic senator. He did an interview. He loves to do interviews because everything that is ever done in government, especially if it's headed by President Trump, Schumer gets right up right away. I need to do an interview. So he did an interview Friday. What happened was the jobs report for July came out Friday. And Schumer did this interview, and in the interview he said, well, it's clear that our economy is losing steam. And so the government needs to do something about it. Our economy is losing steam. Now, the losing steam he was referring to was the fact that in July, we added 1.8 million jobs to the workforce. That's losing steam. The reason he was enabled to say that is because the job report from June was higher than the job report from July. In other words, we didn't add as many jobs in July as we added in June. So to Chuck Schumer, this means our economy is in serious trouble. It's losing steam. The lies that our leaders have been telling themselves, you know what's amazing about it is they actually believe they're telling the truth. They can stand there, look you straight in the eyes, and say something that is patently false, and they have so deluded themselves to believing it's true that they're able to say it with a straight face. That's where these Jewish leaders were 2,700 years ago, and God says that is not good and it's not going to stand. They've been lying for so long, they don't see the truth. So here we are, back in this picture in Isaiah chapter 5, someone is dragging this wagon load of sin through the streets. Of course, if you're going through the streets with a wagon load and you got a rope over your shoulder and you're pulling along, guess what's happening? Everybody is seeing that. This is on display. And here's what's incredible about it. They weren't even a little bit ashamed of the display of their sin. Look at that next verse in verse 19. This is what those leaders were saying, who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work, that we may see it. Look at the pronouns, him, and his. They're all capitalized, they're uppercase. They all refer to God. These Jewish leaders are talking about God. And this is what they say of him. Let him make speed. That phrase, make speed, is the Hebrew word mahar. It means to hurry up. Let him hurry up. Then they go on. Let him hurry up. Let him hasten his work. The word work is ma'asa in Hebrew. It means an action, something that he's going to do. God is telling the Jewish leaders through Isaiah, listen, you have been living with sin and you are going to pay the price. And their response to God is, tell him to hurry up. Let's see what he's going to do. And then they go on. And let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel, that's God, let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come to pass that we may know it. In other words, their response was, we're not doing anything wrong. If God really thinks we're doing something wrong, then let him hurry up and come here and do something about it, because we're not seeing it, and so we're not buying it. That was the arrogance of these Jewish leaders. They're no different than our leaders today in our country, because they can sin with impunity. They can tell lies about it all day long. And then when they're confronted with the truth, their reaction is, you don't even know what you're talking about. I'm telling you, it was a desperate, desperate time in Isaiah's day. Let him hurry, they're saying. We don't see him acting, so we don't figure there's a problem. You know, sin propagates like a virus in our society. Drug use on the rise, robbery, murder, immorality is rampant. Things that were spoken of in hushed terms only one generation or two generations ago are shouted from the rooftops today. Abortion runs nearly rampant in our society. Do you know that on average there are between 40 and 50 million babies that are aborted every year in the world? 40 and 50 million babies. The United States, you know what the abortion rate in the United States is? 3,000 a day. 3,000 babies will never see the light of day in our country every single day. That adds up to more than 1 million, or around 1 million a year. 1 million a year. And this has been happening since 1973. Actually, the first recorded abortion goes back, I think it was 1926 or something like that. But it was legalized by the Supreme Court in 1973. And so between then and now, there's somewhere around 60 million babies that have been murdered in their mother's womb. The statistics are unimaginable. Unimaginable. For every 1,000 live births today, this is right now today, for every 1,000 live births, think of 1,000 babies that are born, 1,000. 186 babies are killed by abortion. For every 1,000. That's almost 1 in 5 pregnancies ended by abortion in our society today. And you have to ask, how can God not do something about that? And that's exactly what the people that are proponents of abortion, those that are providing abortion, that's exactly what they're thinking. But they're a little bit different, though. They're thinking, well, God hasn't done anything. I don't see it's a big deal. These Jewish leaders had a mindset that was upside down. Instead of focusing everything on God and keeping themselves down here, it was backwards. They focused everything on self, and God was down here. If there really is a God, let him do something about it so we might see it. Maybe then we'll believe it. And since they hadn't seen it, they didn't believe it yet. The second problem, though, not only did they have a mindset that was upside down, they had a morality that was upside down. Completely backwards of what it should be. Look at verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. They swapped everything around. What was good in God's eyes became evil in their eyes. What was evil in God's eyes became good in their eyes. It was exactly swapped around. It was happening. This isn't something that was new then, and it's not new today. It was happening long before Isaiah's time. 1 Samuel chapter 2 tells the story of Eli was the high priest at that time. His sons Hophni and Phinehas were priests serving under their father Eli, and they served at the tabernacle. They were disgusting. They were disgusting priests. When someone would bring an offering to offer it to God, they were stealing part of it before it ever got to God. And they didn't have a problem with that. And everybody knew it was happening. There were men and women who were serving in the temple between the utensils and the cleaning and the taking care of the food and everything else. Men and women were serving there. Hophni and Phinehas were sleeping with the women that were serving in the temple. And they didn't have a problem with that. Fast forward to the time of Christ. Matthew chapter 9. The people were still, they thought what was right was wrong, and they thought what was wrong was right. And the people were still doing that, not only in Samuel's time, not only in Isaiah's time, but in the time of Christ. Matthew chapter 9 talks about Christ. He was calling the people to himself to repent. He wanted to teach them what they needed to know in order to get close to God. And so one time he was at dinner, and guess who was there? Tax collectors and sinners. Interesting, he lumped tax collectors with sinners, but that's beside the point. These sinners were there, eating dinner, so that Christ could tell them the gospel. What did the Pharisees do? They complained. Why are you eating with sinners? You shouldn't be doing that. You see, he was doing exactly what he should do, telling the gospel to sinners. Those are the ones that need saved. And to the Pharisees, this was wrong. Absolutely wrong. That's backwards. What they thought was right, what God thought was right, they looked at was wrong. What God thought was wrong, they looked at it as right. John chapter 2, you remember the story where Jesus drove the money changers and the offering sellers out of the temple. You see, there were people, the temple was in Jerusalem. Jews were scattered all over Israel. Actually, they were scattered all over the Mediterranean world. 3 times a year, God required those Jewish men, the leaders, to come to Jerusalem. They were called pilgrimage feasts. So 3 times a year, they had to travel from wherever they were to go to Jerusalem. And for some of them, that was miles and miles away. Okay? Before they came to the temple, they knew that when they got there, one of their primary responsibilities was to bring an animal for sacrifice, a lamb or a bull or some kind of animal for sacrifice. Someone down around Jerusalem had a brilliant idea. You know what? Rather than have this guy carrying this lamb from way up in the north for 50, 60, 70, maybe 100 miles, bringing this lamb to Jerusalem, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of bother. I'm going to start breeding sheep here and producing lambs. And when he comes down here, instead of him bringing his lamb with him, I'll sell him one right here. Who wouldn't want that kind of a deal? The only problem was the people that were selling the animals for sacrifice. Imagine you get to Jerusalem and you haven't brought a lamb with you, and you know that you need a lamb for sacrifice, and so you go into where the lambs were being sold, which, by the way, was right in the temple. And here you are with $10 in your pocket. You say, I need one of the lambs, and the guy says it's going to be $150. Today we call that price gouging. It was a monopoly. And Christ despised it, but the people in the temple, the leaders in the temple, had no problem with it. There were money changers. There was money all over the kingdom, all over the Roman Empire. In most places outside of Israel, those were Roman coins. Roman money was being exchanged. The problem is, you're living and working up somewhere in the north, and you're getting paid in Roman currency. When you come down to the temple, you couldn't bring Roman currency into the temple. You had to have Hebrew shekels, not Roman money. Somebody else had a brilliant idea. I know what I'll do. I'm going to get me a whole bunch of Hebrew shekels, and when these people from the north come down here with a Roman currency, I'll exchange it. Now, what you would think that means is, okay, I have $10 worth of Roman coins. I need $10 worth of Hebrew shekels. We'll just make a swap. Not quite. Because the guy that had the Hebrew shekels said, you know, you're going to have to pay me. I got to do a lot of work to make this happen. You got to underwrite my business, so I got to charge a little bit of a fee. A fee, okay. So I have $10 worth of Roman coins. I need $10 worth of Hebrew shekels. How much is this fee going to cost? $150. Price gouging again. These things were absolutely despicable in the sight of God. They were acceptable to the Jewish leaders. And God condemned. That's why Christ he made a whip out of cords and drove them out of the temple because of that. So they thought what they were doing, they thought what Christ was doing was wrong when it was right, and they thought what they were doing was right when it was wrong. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, substitute light for darkness, and substitute bitter for sweet. This is still happening today. You know, in 1920, our government passed what was called the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was prohibition. Prohibition made it illegal to produce, transport, or sell intoxicating liquor. That was a good thing. And everybody was happy with that, right? No, everybody was not happy with that. There were people that were, you see, up in Canada and down in Mexico, alcoholic beverages were still legal. So there were people running up to Canada and down to Mexico, buying a lot of this alcohol and smuggling it across the border, even though it was illegal to transport it, drink it, or sell it, or produce it. Smuggling it across the border, selling it, and making a lot of money in the process. This went on for nearly 13 years. And the pressure against prohibition built the entire time. Bootlegging, moonshine were big deals back in the 20s. In 1933, the government caved in to pressure from the population, and the 21st Amendment was passed, which got rid of the 18th Amendment. Does anybody possibly think drinking alcohol is a good thing for us? How many families have been ruined? How many lives have been destroyed? Physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, you name it. by alcohol. More recently, the battle to legalize drugs is taking place. State after state now are falling to the pressure to legalize marijuana. It's not that big a deal, they say. Marijuana. Colorado, I forget now, I knew the count before. Many states are now doing that, and they're coming on board. And then, all of a sudden, just like those Jewish leaders that realize, hey, I can make a fast buck here by selling sacrificial animals or exchanging currency at the temple, just like that, state governments today are thinking, if we legalize marijuana, number one, we can regulate it. And number two, we can tax it. Look at the money that's going to come in. And so states like Colorado are caving all the time. The problem is, well, there's a multitude of problems, but one of the problems is marijuana is not the end. There is a push today to legalize pretty much any kind of drug that could possibly be bought, even heroin. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. You know, there's always been a contrast between what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. And it's like a contrast between black and white. Anybody with an honest and open mind, eyes and heart is able to look at it and see the big difference. But today, that contrast is being blurred over and over and over again. These Jewish leaders, they had a mindset that was upside down. So instead of fearing God, they challenged God. Let him bring it, God, bring it if you're going to do something. They also had a morality that was upside down, because what they were doing was allowing man to become the standard of what's right and wrong. That's what most of our leaders in our country today are doing the same thing. Man becomes the standard of what's right and wrong. How else could you explain the legality of abortion? Well, it's the woman's right to choose what she wants to do with her own body. I don't much care what she does with her own body. It's the body inside her that needs to be protected. How do we counter that? Not only in our society, but in our own lives. Because we're sinful creatures. Even those of us that have been born again, come to faith in Jesus Christ, we still have a sin nature. And that sin nature will drift toward those goals if we allow it. So how do we counter that? My mindset has to be that God created me, and I'm answerable to Him. As far as morality is concerned, God's Word has to be the standard of right and wrong. And you know what the interesting thing about that is? You know, Isaiah was written 2,700 years ago. Other books were written even before that. The interesting thing about that is God's standard never changes. Never. 1920, it was illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell liquor in the United States. 1933, it was legal. Before 1920, it was legal. So it was legal, then it was not legal, then it was legal again. The standard kept changing. But God's standard never changes. What has always been right in God's sight is still right today. What has always been wrong in God's sight is still wrong today. I have to understand, I'm answerable to God, and His Word is the standard for me to live my life. One of the members of that infamous 8 men out, the 8 co-conspirators of the 1919 Chicago White Sox team, the one that threw the World Series, one of the members was a guy by the name of Shoeless Joe Jackson. Shoeless Joe Jackson. He was born in Pickens County, South Carolina in 1887. He was the oldest of 8 children. Joe was illiterate all of his life. He never learned to read or write. He figured that wasn't important because all he wanted to do was play baseball. And he said one time, you don't have to read or write to play baseball. Interesting side note, he couldn't even sign his own signature. His wife did that for him. But Shoeless Joe was illiterate. At the age of 13 years old, he was a star on the local textile mills baseball team. had an incredible natural talent for baseball. That's what was important to him. That's all he wanted to do. He lived his life to play baseball. Statistics bear that out. The fact that he remains one of the best players that ever took the field. Many in the world of professional baseball believe that he was the greatest natural hitter in the history of the game. The greatest natural hitter in the history of the game. Babe Ruth. Remember Babe Ruth? Probably one of the most famous players that ever played. Babe Ruth modeled his batting stance from Shoeless Joe Jackson. He said, I learned to hit from Shoeless Joe. Shoeless Joe Jackson's lifetime batting average, I think it was like 30 years old when this scandal happened. And so he lost out on the prime of his career. To this day, his batting average is number 3 in professional baseball, even though he only had half a career. His batting average of .408 as a rookie in 1911 was a record that still stands today. No rookie has ever batted better than he did his first year in baseball. Many consider him to be one of the best outfielders ever. How many of you have seen the 1989 movie Field of Dreams? Anybody see Field of Dreams? Joe Jackson's life was the basis of that movie. That's where it was written from. In 1919, because of a terrible error in judgment, and through the prompting of a friend, he became one of the team members who agreed to throw the World Series. He was given $5,000 to participate. Now, whether it was his conscience that bothered him and he changed his mind, or he never intended to go along with the fix, we'll never know. But what we do know is that his play in the 1919 series was never in doubt. Here was a guy that agreed to be part of the fix. He batted an incredible .375 through the series. He set a record for the most hits in the World Series with 12. He also had a perfect fielding record. He made 0 errors in 8 games, not a single error. From left field, that's where he played, way out in left field, he threw a runner out at home plate on the fly by himself. But because he was implicated in the fix, he was not only banned for life from playing professional baseball, but to this day, and he's been dead a long time, he remains ineligible for the Hall of Fame. Now, for a while, he did play some baseball in Georgia and South Carolina. It wasn't professional. He played under an assumed name, but he would never again play professional ball. In the 1930s, he and his wife moved to Greenville, South Carolina. He ended up operating a liquor store until he died in 1951 at the age of 64. He had a heart attack. But from 1919 until 1951, that's what, 32 years? For the rest of his life, Shoeless Joe Jackson, one of the best baseball players of all time, couldn't play the game that he loved and would never reach his dream of the Hall of Fame. Can you imagine the regret that he lived with all of those years, day after day after day, realizing he gave it all up because he made the wrong choice? I don't know about you, but I don't want to get to the end of my life being plagued with regret. I don't want to get to the end of my life thinking, oh, I wish I'd lived for the Lord. I wish I'd have gotten closer to the Lord. I wish I'd have gotten to know God better. I don't want to get to the end of my life having lived with regret for even one single day. The Jewish leaders failed because their focus was not on God. Today, our focus needs to be on Jesus Christ. He created us. He died for us to pay for our sin. And if I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, if I've accepted Him as my Lord, then I need to be living every day with that reality, always pointing to Him, always focusing on Him, always honoring Him, always doing everything that I can to obey Him, in spite of what the society is doing around me. That church out in California I mentioned that in my prayer this morning. They have been sent a strongly worded letter from first from the state government under Governor Newsom, and now from the mayor of Los Angeles, that if you hold services, we're going to shut off your power. We're going to shut off your light. And they have said, we're not going to cave. We don't serve Caesar, we serve Christ. And that's where they stand. The focus of their life, of their heart, of their ministry is on Jesus. And no matter what happens to them, and by the way, you should pray for them, no matter what happens to them, they have the right pursuit and they've made the right choice. We should do the same thing. Let's pray together.